Hello and welcome to the latest edition of China Inc. by Bamboo Works, where we discuss the latest business and financial news from China and what it all means. I'm Doug Young, Bamboo Works Editor-in-Chief, and I'm joined today by Renee Vangusten, one of our founding partners, who's also a longtime China watcher and former investment banker. Today we'll look at the wandering IPO for fast fashion sensation Shein and where it's headed next. We'll also look at a ramped-up global expansion for hotpot chain Haidilao. We'll start with Shein, which, as many people know, is China's online answer to fast fashion chains like Uniqlo and Zara. Shein has tens of billions of dollars in market value to offer investors, but it can't seem to find a stock market to host its stock. It's been looking to make an IPO for the better part of a year now in what could become one of the year's biggest new listings worth billions of dollars. The company originally filed to list in the U.S., only to move its sites to London. Now, the latest reports say it's not ruling out Hong Kong either. So, Renee, why are we seeing this global game of hopscotch for a company that would normally be quite welcome on any global stock exchange?
One word. Geopolitics.
Yes.
This is a company that, at least as far as a U.S. listing is concerned, has had a few strikes against it from a political standpoint. The first one is obviously the relationship issues between China and the U.S., in an election year, on top of that, with a pretty strong majority across the aisle in Congress who really have issues with China.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, it has been accused, and I insist on accused, to use forced labor, at least somewhere inside its supply chain. Forced labor has become a big issue in the relationship between China and the U.S., and it has to do primarily with Xinjiang. It affected solar companies, and it affects companies in the textile/apparel sector because of cotton produced in Xinjiang. And then a third political aspect to it is the fact that they and others, not just Shein, but exploit a loophole which allows them to sell to U.S. consumers and deliver to them without paying import duties on the merchandise that they sell to U.S. consumers. So that's, I wouldn't say it's three strikes you're out, but there's a lot of baggage there.
Right.
There's a lot of baggage there, and that's why there's been, so much pressure in the U.S. to basically not allow the company to be listed there.
Mm-hmm.
So the next step basically was to look at London. Europeans have as many issues or as much grief, if you want, about forced labor anywhere in the world, not just in China.
Right.
But definitely in this case, looking at China. So you have seen a growing opposition to a London listing on political considerations as well as forced labor considerations. Amnesty International has been very strongly involved and opposed to Shein on account of forced labor. So that's basically what you have happening here. Why all of a sudden start thinking about Hong Kong as another backup solution? Well, it's not just apparently the politics that are involved, at least directly, as politics, but there are also a number of institutional investors in the UK, England, Scotland, who are very focused on ESG, not to mention across Europe, very focused on ESG as investing policies or guidelines, and with some of them having already indicated that they wouldn't buy the stock on account of the accusations of forced labor. Now, obviously, the London Stock Exchange would love nothing better, so far at least, as to, see Shein do its IPO and list on the London Stock Exchange. I mean, nothing much has happened on the London Stock Exchange for a long, long time.
Yeah, not for China.
This would obviously be a coup. They couldn't even secure the listing of ARM, the SoftBank-owned company, when it did its IPO. They went to do it in New York, which usually gave the London Stock Exchange and the London market a bit of a black eye, because that's a UK company. So this obviously would be very welcome as far as the exchange is concerned. But I think that everything that's been going around the issue of a potential listing in the UK, in London, has, I would say, quite normally gotten the company to start thinking that maybe they need to look at Hong Kong as a fallback position.
Mm-hmm. So, so we've mentioned 3 markets so far: New York, London, Hong Kong. I mean, where do you, obviously no one can predict the future, but where do you think this thing will end up popping up? And, do you think its shares are going to be blacklisted by a lot of investors, or do you think it'll get a good reception, or how do you see that going?
Well, that's this whole issue of ESG investing has baffled me for a long, long time.
You're not
a lot of investors, a lot of institutions talk a good talk, but they do not always, follow the talk in terms of what they actually do from an investing standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty obvious. It's been obvious for a long time on the G part of ESG, where clearly, global investors have invested in Chinese companies because they thought they would make money, despite overall pretty bad governance in Chinese companies. So, but this, however, is a bit different, because when you do not do what you say on the G, being governance, it's one thing. I would think lots of people in the public wouldn't care. They probably would not even know. Here, though, you're talking about social, and that is something that not just investors, but the public in general, pays attention to.
Mm-hmm.
More in Europe, I think, than in the US. But so, I would expect that no matter where it lists, some of the European investors would actually not buy the stock until the company is able to completely clear its name with respect to forced labor. We've seen that in the solar sector, for instance, and I've worked with some of the Chinese solar companies listed in the US, and they've had to go through, pretty substantial efforts to be able to correctly, accurately, extensively trace the origin of materials and be able to convince both the US authorities, in the case of the solar companies, as well as investors, or at least a lot of them, that the solar panels that end up in the US or in Europe do not actually contain any material that originated from Xinjiang. So you would think that somewhat Shein will be asked eventually to do something similar. It requires very substantial resources. In the case, I think that, it would have probably to start sourcing some of its material to manufacture clothes from outside China, which I would think would then make them more expensive. It's a pretty big issue. I think that they're not going to be able to get away from very quickly and very easily and with cheap cost.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah, I think, this is a whole other issue, but the way Shein is set up is they work with a gazillion different suppliers. And I guess when you have that many suppliers and a lot of stuff, a lot of them are sort of cheaper, smaller operations, I guess it's hard to trace, tracing all the cotton that each one of them uses and their materials is probably not that easy. But, I guess it's something they'll have to try and do if they really want to sell people on their ESG store.
Right. The other thing that they did is we all know they basically moved their headquarters to Singapore, try and convince the world that they were not a Chinese company anymore. That's a little too cute, I think. The world these days is not putting up for that kind of artificial solution.
Yeah, I don't think people are fooled by that either. All right, let's move on to our next story, which is Haidilao, which anyone in China knows these guys. They're a very hot pot chain in China, which is one of their favorite ways of eating. But Haidilao's international alter ego is a company called Super High. Super High was spun off from Haidilao for a Hong Kong listing 2 years ago. So this is just operating their international stores. And Super High followed up that with a second listing in New York earlier this year. So we want to talk about the international operation this time. The company's been building up the global footprint, and it had 119 restaurants in Southeast Asia, the US, and Europe at the end of March. Surprisingly, this makes it one of China's largest restaurant chains to go abroad so far. So the question to you is, what's your take on this overseas expansion? Do you see this company becoming the next McDonald's or perhaps the next Chili's or Pizza Hut might be more precise, since this is really a full-service restaurant chain?
I think that, look, very clearly, they've placed a very high priority on their international expansion, including reassigning a few of their top executives to focus on the international business. There's a pretty clear message there. I think part of the message, probably very likely, is that there is a limit to how much more they can grow in China, which is obviously a very competitive market. When somebody becomes successful in one sector, very quickly you have other people who decide to do the same thing, compete on price and so on.
Right.
You can look at what has happened on the coffee side with Luckin Coffee and Coty and Manor Coffee and all of that. So I think that that is what's happening here. Now, I would think that they probably have a better chance in Southeast Asia from, I would say, a food preference standpoint. I know they have some in the US. I think that they would definitely have some success in the US, if only with the Asian community, at least up to a point and for some time. There have been a bunch of Korean barbecue chains in the US who have done relatively well, at least in parts of the US where you have Asian communities that are, of a certain size. So I would expect that Haidilao is going to kind of ride a similar wave. And I would think that at least for a period of time, there will be some amount of interest on the part of non-Asian people as well, in terms of trying hotpot cuisine or whatever, something new, something different. I would expect that some people will stick with it outside the Asian community.
Right.
But I would think that most people probably will not. I mean, the food culture, the food habits and so on, the dining out habits are pretty well entrenched in the US when it comes to the kind of food that most Americans, especially outside the big cities, want to eat. I'm not sure that the Hispanic community, which obviously is growing relatively fast in the US as well, and the black communities would be very strong long-term consumers of Chinese food.
Mm-hmm.
But look, it's a big market. I mean, it's a 350 million people market right now. Given the economics of life in the US, especially for middle class and lower, the relatively cheap alternative in a sit-down style restaurant could certainly be attractive to some people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they'll have some success. I would think that their chances are much, much higher in Southeast Asia.
Okay. Well, how about just looking at, this whole Chinese retail going abroad phenomenon in general? If we look at China, they've successfully exported a lot of their stuff, like, smartphones and computers, but their retail chains, including restaurants, really haven't had that much success so far. Moving sort of above beyond just Haidilao, is there any reason? Is it just people don't like Asian or Chinese retail, or is it something about their approach? And do you see things changing at all in that regard?
Well, I don't think I would go that far as saying, Chinese companies have had a tremendous success exporting smartphones and computers to the US market. The US market in terms of smartphone is predominantly iPhone. Samsung has had a pretty large market share outside of Apple, and so has Google. I'm not really aware of any meaningful penetration by Chinese smartphone manufacturers in the US market.
Right. I was talking sort of more globally, not just, just outside of China.
No, globally, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, it's one thing. Everybody wants a smartphone, and Chinese companies have been producing decent smartphones pretty cheaply. So, no surprise that a lot of people around the world, and I think of India, for instance, where 2 or 3 brands, Xiaomi, including Xiaomi, have been pretty successful in selling smartphones.
Right.
There's a big market outside the US and to some extent outside Europe for, smaller, cheaper, quality smartphone computers and so on. And people need them. When it comes to retail, you could point to Temu and Shein, who obviously have had success in the US on the retail side, even though they don't obviously have a physical footprint there.
Right.
When it comes to food, though, I think that's a little bit different because of culture, because of habits. You may be tempted from a curiosity standpoint to try something new and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But, a lot of my Chinese friends, for instance, say, they like to go to the US and eat a good steak from time to time. But most of the time, they're still going to be looking for Chinese food. And that's because food is deeply ingrained in culture. You in it almost from the moment you're born and as you grow up. And I think it's pretty much the same thing for American people. My wife and I have gone occasionally to Asian restaurants, Chinese restaurants, Korean barbecue, and so on in the US. And yeah, you'll see occasionally a few Caucasians, but by far, 80%, 90% of the consumers in those restaurants are Asian people.
Okay. Chinese food definitely has a place in U.S. culture, but it's not sort of the authentic kind of Chinese food that Haidilao and, these more authentic Chinese people offer up.
Well, the Chinese food in the U.S. is basically pork with broccoli and walnuts, kind of, and a bit of rice. That's kind of the traditional Chinese American food, and then fortune cookies.
Right, which don't even exist in China.
Right. So
figure the authentic stuff may have a ways to go. Let's wrap things up there. Right. Thanks everybody for joining us this week. In our next program, we'll look at a slow rebound for air traffic between China and Europe. And we'll also look at a recent explosion in IPO applications from China's autonomous driving sector. If you like what you hear, please tell your friends about us and rate us and share us on your favorite podcast app. Meantime, hope to see you all next week. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye. Thank you all.